The radio went silent just before dawn. 1,000 Marines were trapped in a frozen valley, surrounded, outnumbered, and written off by command. Protocol was clear. All snipers were ordered to withdraw, no exceptions. From a distant ridgeline, two sisters listened to the order and then looked at each other. If they obeyed, the battalion would die by sunrise. If they stayed, they would become ghosts. They turned off their radios, split their positions, and waited for the light. At dawn, everything changed. The temperature had dropped to 14 below zero. Ice crystals formed on every exposed surface, turning the valley into a mirror of death. Captain Rachel Hartwell pressed her scope against her eye socket, watching the scene unfold 3,000 yards below. 1,000 Marines, maybe more, scattered across the valley floor like pieces on a board game already lost. They had walked into an ambush 6 hours ago. The entire 3rd Battalion, moving through what intelligence had promised was a cleared zone. Intelligence had been wrong. The enemy had been waiting, patient as winter itself, letting the columns stretch thin before closing the trap. Now the Marines were pinned. No air support weather had grounded everything with rotors or wings. No artillery, they were beyond range of the firebase. No rescue command had already written them off as acceptable losses in a larger strategic picture. Rachel could see them digging in. Shallow fighting positions carved from frozen earth, meager cover behind rocks and fallen equipment. They were preparing for the assault that would come with sunrise. The enemy always attacked at dawn. It was doctrine, it was tradition, it was inevitable. Beside her, separated by 40 feet of rocky ridgeline, her sister waited. Lieutenant Sarah Hartwell had the same scope, the same rifle, the same view of the valley floor. They had been inserted 72 hours ago as advance reconnaissance, 2 snipers, working the high ground, gathering intelligence on enemy movements. They had done their job, they had reported everything, and then the battalion had walked into hell anyway. The radio crackled one final time. The voice was distant, breaking up through layers of atmosphere and desperation. All sniper teams, this is Overwatch Command, execute Protocol 7. I say again, execute Protocol 7. Withdraw to Extraction Point Delta, acknowledge. Protocol 7, the emergency withdrawal order. No questions, no delays, no exceptions. Rachel's finger hovered over the transmit button. Around the valley, she knew other sniper teams were already packing up, already moving through the dark towards safety. Protocol 7 meant the situation was hopeless. It meant command was cutting losses. It meant everyone who could leave should leave now. She looked at her sister. Sarah was already looking back. In the scope, Rachel watched a young Marine couldn't have been more than 19 trying to dig deeper into the frozen ground. His entrenching tool sparked against permafrost. He was crying. She could see that, even from 3,000 yards. Crying and digging and waiting for dawn. We have to acknowledge, Rachel said quietly. Her breath formed clouds that dissipated instantly in the wind. Sarah didn't answer immediately. She was counting something in her head. Rachel knew what. Angles, distances, wind speed, temperature gradients. All the variables that turned mathematics into life or death. They'll die, Sarah finally said. All of them. By 0700, that valley becomes a graveyard. Protocol is protocol. Protocol is written by people who aren't watching. Rachel closed her eyes. She had been in the Marines for 12 years, Sarah for 11. They had followed orders through 3 deployments, 4 theaters of operation, countless missions. They had never once broken protocol. That was what separated professionals from cowboys. That was what kept people alive. Except now, protocol meant death, just not their death. If we stay, Rachel said carefully, we face court-martial, end of career, maybe worse. If we leave, we face ourselves. For the rest of our lives. Down in the valley, the young Marine had given up digging. He sat with his back against his inadequate hole, rifle across his knees, staring at the eastern horizon where light would soon spill across the world. Rachel made her decision. She reached down and switched off her radio. The small LED that had glowed green for 72 hours went dark. With it went her career, her future, possibly her freedom. Sarah watched her sister's hand move. Then she reached for her own radio. Click. Darkness. Silence. 2 positions, Sarah said. Maximum separation. Overlapping fields of fire. You take the southern approach. I'll cover north. Conserve ammunition. Shoot command structure only. Make every shot count. They had worked together so long that planning took seconds. Each knew what the other would do before the words were spoken. They had shared a womb before they shared a battlefield. Some connections ran deeper than doctrine. Sarah began crawling backward from her position, dragging her rifle and gear bag. She would circle south, find a new hide, establish her angle. They wouldn't communicate again except through action. Every muzzle flash would be a conversation. Every target eliminated would be a sentence in a shared language. Rachel adjusted her scope. The enemy was out there, beyond the valley rim, hidden in their own positions. She could see the occasional movement, a shifting shadow, a careless silhouette against snowpack. They were confident. They had numbers. They had position. They had time. They didn't know about the sisters on the ridge. The eastern sky began its slow transition from black to gray. Somewhere behind enemy lines, officers would be checking watches, reviewing attack plans, preparing their forces for the final assault. They would move with dawn, because that's when defenders were most exhausted, most demoralized, most likely to break. Rachel settled into her position. She regulated her breathing. She became part of the rock, part of the ice, part of the wind itself. This was the zone where thought disappeared and instinct ruled. This was where training dissolved into pure focus. Through her scope, she found her first target. An enemy officer, 3,200 yards distant, moving between positions with the confidence of someone who believed himself beyond reach. He carried himself differently than the soldiers around him. Authority in his posture, command in his gestures. Rachel adjusted for wind, for temperature, for the curve of the earth itself. At this distance, her finger found the trigger. The young Marine down in the valley was still staring at the horizon, waiting for the light that would bring his death. Rachel exhaled slowly and waited for her sister to be ready. Because when they started this, there would be no stopping. No second chances, no way back. The radio silence wasn't just broken, it was shattered. They had crossed a line that no protocol could recross. 1,000 Marines were about to find out what two women could do when they decided that some orders were meant to be defied. Rachel and Sarah Hartwell had been born 18 minutes apart in a military hospital outside of 29 Palms. Their father, Sergeant Major James Hartwell, had been in the field when labor started. He made it back just in time to meet his daughters through nursery glass, still wearing his combat boots and desert camouflage. He raised them alone after their mother left. Some women couldn't handle the life, the deployments, the uncertainty, the long silences broken only by brief phone calls from places that couldn't be named. Their mother had lasted 4 years before the loneliness consumed her capacity to stay. James never spoke badly of her. He simply folded her absence into the routine and moved forward. That was the Marine way. Adapt and overcome. The twins grew up on base housing and deployment cycles. They learned to read by studying their father's field manuals. They learned geography through the places he was sent: Kosovo, Iraq, Afghanistan, back to Iraq. Each deployment meant months of waiting, of checking casualty reports with held breath, of jumping at every knock on the door. They learned something else too. They learned that some people run toward danger while others run away. And they learned which kind of person they wanted to be. James taught them to shoot when they were 12. Not on a whim or for entertainment, but with the same systematic precision he applied to everything: breathing, trigger control, wind reading, ballistics. He taught them that shooting wasn't about violence, it was about mathematics made physical. Every bullet was a problem to be solved. The sisters took to it differently. Rachel approached marksmanship like an equation. She studied ballistics tables, memorized wind formulas, kept detailed logs of every shot. Her targets were perfect center mass clusters. Her performance was consistent, predictable, excellent. Sarah shot by feel. She could sense wind shift before it happened. She understood bullet drop through instinct rather than calculation. Her groups were tighter than Rachel's, but she couldn't always explain how she achieved them. She just knew. James recognized what he had: two complementary approaches to the same problem: Rachel's precision and Sarah's intuition. Together, they could reach levels neither could achieve alone. When they turned 18, they enlisted together. Same day, same recruiter, same oath. James stood in the back of the ceremony, 42 years old, 24 years in service, watching his daughters begin the journey he had walked before them. He deployed to Helmand Province 6 months later, an IED hidden in a irrigation ditch. The blast took him and 3 others. By the time the twins got leave to attend the funeral, he had already been buried with full honors at Arlington. Sarah wanted to quit that day, walk away from the corps, from the wars, from all of it. Rachel talked her down during the long night after the funeral, sitting on cheap hotel beds in their dress blues, splitting a bottle of whiskey their father would never drink. "He didn't die for nothing," Rachel said. "He died doing what he believed in. Walking away doesn't honor that. Finishing what we started that honors it." Sarah had nodded, drunk and grieving and angry at a world that took fathers and gave back folded flags. They returned to their units. They trained harder. They volunteered for every school, every qualification, every opportunity to become better at the craft their father had taught them. Scout Sniper School came 3 years into their service. The course had a 93% washout rate. Most candidates broke during the stalking exercises, crawling through brush for hours, covering mere yards, trying to get close enough to observer towers without being spotted. Or they broke during the shooting tests, where anything less than perfect meant failure. Rachel and Sarah didn't break. They finished first and second in their class. Rachel's written tests were the highest scores in school history. Sarah's field performance set records that still stood. The instructors struggled to rank them because they excelled in different aspects. Eventually they gave up and simply noted that the Hartwell sisters represented a complete sniper package split across 2 bodies. Their reputation spread quickly through the sniper community. Twin sisters, both qualified, both deadly, both carrying their father's legacy like a rifle sling across their shoulders. They deployed together to Kandahar, then Mosul, then places that never made the news. They worked as a team, which was unconventional sniper doctrine emphasized individual hides and individual shots. But their commanders quickly learned that the Hartwell sisters produced results. Enemy officers who thought themselves safe behind lines would simply drop. Weapons caches that had remained hidden for months would suddenly be reported with precise coordinates. The sisters saw things others missed. They communicated without speaking. A decade of shared life meant they had developed a language of glances and gestures more precise than radio traffic. In the field, they could coordinate complex movements with nothing more than eye contact. But they were different people beneath the shared profession. Rachel believed in rules. Protocol existed for reasons, hard lessons learned through blood and failure. She had been formally counseled twice during her career, both times for refusing orders she believed endangered her team through poor planning. She would break rules, but only after carefully weighing consequences. Rebellion for her was a calculated risk, not an impulse. Sarah believed in outcomes. She would follow rules that made sense and ignore ones that didn't. She had been formally counseled 5 times, twice for ignoring movement orders to maintain overwatch on friendly units, once for engaging targets outside her designated sector, twice for refusing extraction while friendly forces remained in contact. For Sarah, the mission was whatever kept people alive, regardless of what the operations order said. Their differences had led to their current positions. Rachel was a captain, on track for promotion, respected by command. Sarah was still a lieutenant, passed over twice for promotion, regarded as talented but unreliable. James would have understood both of them. He had raised them to think for themselves, to question authority when authority was wrong. But he had also taught them that the institution was larger than any individual, and that discipline held the line between order and chaos. Now, on a frozen ridgeline above a valley of dying Marines, those different philosophies were converging toward the same conclusion. Rachel, who believed in protocol, was breaking it. Sarah, who trusted instinct, was trusting her sister's judgment. And somewhere in the space between those decisions, 1,000 lives hung in the balance. The sky continued its slow brightening, gray becoming pearl, becoming the first hints of gold. Sarah had reached her southern position by now. Rachel couldn't see her, but she knew. Same way she always knew where her sister was. Even in darkness, even in chaos. They had 17 minutes until sunrise. 17 minutes to prepare for a battle they couldn't win, but couldn't avoid. Rachel checked her ammunition count. 47 rounds. Sarah would have the same. 94 rounds total between them. The enemy had at least 2,000 fighters in the Valley Rim. The mathematics were impossible, but mathematics had never stopped them before. Rachel remembered something their father had said during one of those childhood shooting lessons, watching them burn through box after box of ammunition on the range. Shooting isn't about the bullets you have, it's about the fear you create with the bullets you place. Make them afraid of the dark. Make them afraid of distance. Make them believe they're fighting ghosts. That was the game now. Not killing 2,000 fighters. Creating the illusion that help had arrived, that the Marines below weren't alone, that salvation existed on the ridgeline. Through her scope, Rachel found the enemy officer again. He was closer now, moved forward to observe his troops' final preparations. Confident, careless, she centered the crosshairs on his chest. Then she moved up, just slightly, to the head. Because this first shot had to be perfect. It had to be shocking. It had to make everyone watching believe that something impossible had just occurred. Sarah would be aiming at her own target now. Some other officer, some other symbol of command. They would shoot within seconds of each other, not coordinated by watch or signal, but by that deeper rhythm they shared. The enemy officer straightened, turned, presented his profile cleanly against the morning sky. Rachel breathed in, held it, let her heartbeats slow to the steady drum of someone who had made peace with consequence. The young Marine in the valley was standing now. She could see him through her peripheral vision, just a kid, rifle in hand, waiting for the sunrise that would bring the attack. 15 minutes to dawn. Rachel's finger completed its pressure on the trigger. The rifle spoke. And 3,200 yards away, an enemy officer who had been planning his assault suddenly lost his ability to plan anything at all. The war for the valley had begun. The bullet took 3.7 seconds to travel from Rachel's rifle to the target. In that time, the officer moved slightly, not enough to matter, but enough that the round struck 2 inches lower than Rachel had aimed. It hit him in the throat instead of the head. Through the scope, she watched him drop, watched the spray of arterial blood appear black in the pre-dawn light, watched the soldiers around him scatter, diving for cover, unsure where death had come from. 2 seconds later, another officer fell on the southern approach. Sarah's shot, center mass, textbook perfect. The enemy troops were now in chaos. Officers barking orders at an invisible threat. Soldiers scanning ridgelines with the panicked movements of prey animals. They had been preparing to attack, and suddenly, they were the ones being attacked. Rachel worked her bolt, the empty casing ejected, spinning away into the dark. She chambered another round and was already scanning for her next target before the brass hit stone. The doctrine of sniper employment was clear. 1 shot, 1 kill, then relocate. Never fire twice from the same position. The enemy would triangulate muzzle flash, call in mortars or counter sniper fire, and you would die in the hole you were too stubborn to leave. But doctrine assumed you had somewhere to relocate to. It assumed you valued survival over mission. It assumed you weren't trying to save 1,000 Marines with 94 bullets. Rachel stayed put and found her second target. A platoon leader, rallying his troops, pointing toward the valley floor. He was good getting his people organized, restoring order. That made him a problem. She shot him through the chest. He fell backward, and the soldiers he'd been directing scattered again. The chaos was spreading like ripples across a pond. 3 commanders down in 90 seconds. No one knew how many snipers they were facing. No one knew where the shots were coming from. No one wanted to be the 4th officer to die. Sarah fired again. Rachel couldn't see the target, but she recognized the rhythm of her sister's shooting. Steady, methodical, making every round count. Down in the valley, the Marines were starting to realize something was happening. Rachel could see them pointing at the enemy positions, watching the disruption spread through the opposing force. They didn't know what was causing it, but they knew the attack hadn't come yet, and that was hope where none had existed before. A radio crackled, not Rachel's, which she had turned off, but the enemy's tactical net. She had a scanner in her gear bag, preset to common frequencies. The voice was frantic, speaking a language she didn't need to translate to understand. They were reporting snipers, multiple snipers, long-range precision fire, casualties among leadership. Good. Let them believe in multiples. Let them believe they were facing an entire platoon of ghosts instead of 2 women with a death wish. Rachel shifted her aim to the eastern approach. The sun was nearly up now, painting the horizon in shades of amber and gold. Beautiful morning for dying. She found a cluster of soldiers preparing a heavy machine gun. The weapon could shred the Marines below once the attack began. The crew was working efficiently. Gunner, assistant gunner, ammunition handler. Well trained. She shot the gunner first. He collapsed across the weapon. The assistant gunner reached for him, trying to pull him away, and Sarah's rifle spoke from the south. The assistant gunner crumpled. The ammunition handler looked around wildly, then abandoned the gun and ran. Smart choice. 4 minutes to sunrise. The enemy was supposed to be attacking by now. Instead, they were pinned by an invisible threat they couldn't locate or suppress. But they had resources. Rachel and Sarah didn't. Within seconds of the machine gun crew going down, Rachel heard a new sound, the distinctive whump-whump of mortars being deployed. They weren't targeting the valley anymore. They were targeting the ridgeline. The first mortar round landed 300 yards south of Rachel's position. Too far to be dangerous, but close enough to show they were guessing her location. The second round landed closer, 200 yards. They were walking fire along the ridgeline, trying to flush her out or kill her through saturation. Rachel didn't move. Movement would give away her position more surely than staying still. She pressed herself flat against the rock and kept shooting. A squad leader organizing his troops, gone. A soldier with a radio, likely a forward observer, calling in those mortars, gone. A fighter trying to drag a wounded comrade to safety. She hesitated on that one. Shooting wounded or those rendering aid violated the rules of warfare. But he was also carrying a rifle, also part of the enemy force, and she couldn't afford mercy when 1,000 Marines were depending on her bullets. She shot him in the leg, not lethal, but enough to take him out of the fight, a compromise with her conscience. The mortars were getting closer. Sarah would be facing the same problem. They couldn't stay in these positions much longer, but they couldn't leave either. Moving meant losing the angles, losing the effectiveness, losing the illusion that the ridgeline was filled with defenders. Rachel made a decision. She switched her radio back on. Not to command, she had burned that bridge, but the Marines in the valley would be monitoring their tactical frequency. She keyed the microphone and spoke quietly, calmly, with the voice of someone in complete control. Any Marine receiving this transmission, this is Overwatch. You have sniper support on the ridgeline. Maintain your positions. Help is coming. Sunrise protocol is in effect. Acknowledge if you copy. Silence for 3 seconds. Then a voice, young and cracking with emotion. Overwatch. This is 3rd Battalion Actual. We copy. We thought we were alone. Rachel's throat tightened. You're not alone, Battalion. Hold your positions. Make them pay for every yard. We've got your back. Who are you? Ghosts, Rachel said, and turned the radio back off. She went back to shooting. The mortars were landing in a pattern now, walking north along the ridgeline. They would reach her position in the next salvo. She could stay and die, or move and break the illusion. Sarah made the choice for her. Another shot from the south, but this one wasn't aimed at enemy troops. It was aimed at the mortar position itself. 3,500 yards, extreme range, shooting at a target she could probably barely see. The round hit one of the mortar tubes dead center. Rachel didn't know if Sarah had been aiming for the tube or the crew, but the effect was spectacular. The mortar round that had been loaded into the tube detonated, and the entire position went up in a cascade of secondary explosions. The mortar fire stopped. Rachel allowed herself a tight smile. That was Sarah when Doctrine said hide and wait. She said attack the problem directly. The sun broke the horizon. Golden light spilled across the valley floor, illuminating 1,000 Marines who had survived to see it. They were battered, exhausted, probably low on ammunition, but they were alive, and the attack that was supposed to come with dawn hadn't come. Instead, the enemy was reorganizing, taking casualties, trying to figure out how to fight an opponent they couldn't see. Rachel scanned the valley rim through her scope. She counted at least 30 bodies, enemy soldiers and officers who would never see another sunset. Sarah had probably accounted for another 15 or 20 on the southern approach. 45 enemy down, 49 rounds expended between them. 955 enemy fighters remaining, 45 rounds left. The mathematics still didn't work, but the psychology was shifting. The enemy had been confident, certain of victory. Now they were afraid. Fear was a weapon more powerful than any bullet. Through her scope, Rachel saw something that made her heart sink. Vehicles, moving toward the valley from the east. Not enemy reinforcements, these were different, larger, moving in the distinctive pattern of a mechanized column. For one terrible moment, she thought command had sent armor to finish what the ambush started. Then she recognized the profiles. American vehicles, reinforcements for the Marines below. Someone had countermanded the withdrawal order. Or the Marine situation had changed priority. Or some officer somewhere had decided 1,000 lives were worth the risk after all. Help was coming, real help, with armor and infantry and all the resources that Rachel and Sarah didn't have. They had bought enough time. The Marines would survive. Rachel keyed her radio one final time. 3rd Battalion, Overwatch. Armor column approaching from east. ETA, 15 minutes. Hold position and prepare for friendly arrival. Overwatch, we copy. Thank you. We, whoever you are, thank you. Rachel didn't respond. She safed her rifle and began the process of withdrawing from her position. Sarah would be doing the same from the south. They needed to be gone before the reinforcements arrived, before anyone asked questions about who had been providing sniper support. They had saved 1,000 Marines, and in doing so, they had ended their careers. The withdrawal took hours. Rachel moved like smoke across the ridgeline, using every depression and shadow to mask her movement. The enemy was still out there, still dangerous, still hunting for the snipers who had devastated their attack. She covered 3 miles in 4 hours, moving at the pace of caution rather than speed. Sarah would be paralleling her route on the southern slope. They had planned this during their initial insertion. Multiple exfiltration routes, coded rally points, contingencies for contingencies. Now, those plans were keeping them alive. The terrain was brutal. Frozen scree that shifted under every step, ice sheets that could send you sliding down a cliff face, wind that cut through gear and skin like a blade. Rachel's hands were numb despite her gloves. Her face burned with cold despite the scarf wrapped around it. She moved anyway, stopped when necessary, used the scope to scan ahead before committing to each new section of ground. This was the part of combat that never made stories, the grinding hours of exhaustion and discomfort, the slow work of staying alive. Behind her, she heard the sounds of battle resuming. The armor had arrived. The Marines were being reinforced. The enemy was withdrawing, their attack broken, their leaders dead, their confidence shattered. The valley was being held. Rachel allowed herself no sense of victory. Victory meant questions. Victory meant investigations. Victory meant someone would want to know who had ignored Protocol 7 and why. She reached the first rally point by midday. A cluster of rocks that formed a natural shelter, marked on their map, with coordinates that meant nothing to anyone but the two of them. Sarah wasn't there yet. Rachel waited, checked her watch. Sarah should have reached this point 30 minutes ago if she had moved at normal pace. 45 minutes ago if she had been delayed by enemy patrols. An hour passed. Rachel felt the first touch of real fear. Sarah was never late. Even in training, even in exercises where timing didn't matter, Sarah had an internal clock that was never wrong. If she wasn't here, something had happened. Rachel forced herself to think tactically. Sarah could be pinned down, could be injured, could be taking an alternate route for reasons Rachel couldn't know. Moving to search for her meant exposing herself, risking both of them, possibly creating a crisis where none existed. She waited another hour. Used the time to strip and clean her rifle, check her remaining ammunition, eat from the cold rations in her pack. Professional habits to keep panic at bay. Her radio crackled. Sarah's voice, barely a whisper. North route compromised. Taking South Ridge, 2 hours. Rachel exhaled. Copy. See you soon. The transmission ended. Short, encoded, using terms that would sound like static to anyone scanning frequencies. Sarah was alive, moving, delayed, but not in immediate danger. Rachel settled in to wait. The sun tracked across the sky. The temperature rose from brutal to merely bitter. In the distance, she could see helicopters moving over the valley, medevac birds extracting wounded, probably cargo birds bringing in supplies. The Marines were being taken care of. The system was working now that someone in command had decided they were worth saving. Sarah appeared exactly 2 hours later, materializing from the rocks like she had been born from stone. She looked exhausted, face wind-burned, eyes red-rimmed, moving with the careful precision of someone at the end of their reserves. Ran into a patrol. Sarah said quietly, dropping her pack. Had to detour 5 miles east. Contact? Avoided. Hid in a crevasse for an hour while they searched. Sarah pulled out her water bottle, took a long drink. They're looking hard. We hurt them. We saved them, Rachel corrected. Same thing, depending on perspective. Sarah sat down heavily. What's the plan? Rachel had been thinking about that for hours. Command knows someone stayed behind. They'll investigate. They'll find evidence, shell casings, disturbance patterns, ballistics. Eventually, they'll figure out it was us. How long? Days. Maybe a week if we're lucky. Sarah nodded. She had known this was coming. They both had. Court-martial? Best case scenario. Worst case, they make an example. Dereliction of duty during combat operations. Refusing direct orders. Operating outside chain of command. Rachel listed the charges like an inventory of their sins. We could be looking at years in military prison. Worth it. Is it? Sarah looked at her sister. 1,000 Marines went home. 1,000 Marines saw another sunrise. Yeah, it's worth it. Rachel wanted to argue, to point out that principle and practicality weren't the same thing, that sacrifice without strategy was just waste. But she couldn't. Because she had made the same choice Sarah had. She had turned off her radio knowing exactly what it meant. We need to get to the extraction point, Rachel said. Turn ourselves in before they send hunters. Or we disappear. Rachel stared. What? We disappear, Sarah repeated. We're good at being invisible. We walk away. New identities. New lives. Let command think we died on that ridge. Sarah. I'm serious. We've got skills. We've got training. We could survive outside the system. As what? Mercenaries? Criminals? Rachel shook her head. That's not who we are. No. We're the people who followed orders until following orders meant watching people die. Then, we broke protocol. Sarah's voice was hard. If we turn ourselves in, command destroys us to protect the protocol we broke. We become the lesson. The warning. The reason why everyone else has to obey without question. Rachel had no counter-argument because Sarah was right. That was exactly what would happen. Command couldn't allow their defiance to go unpunished. The military ran on discipline. If 2 snipers could pick and choose which orders to follow, the entire structure became negotiable. Dad wouldn't have run, Rachel said quietly. Dad died following orders. You want that to be our memorial too? They sat in silence, watching the afternoon light paint shadows across the mountains. 2 sisters, 2 rifles, 2 diverging visions of what came next. Finally, Rachel spoke. If we run, we prove them right. That we were reckless. That we put ourselves above the mission. That we can't be trusted. And if we turn ourselves in, we're martyrs to a system that was willing to let 1,000 Marines die because the paperwork said they were acceptable losses. So what do we do? Sarah smiled, not with humor, but with the grim recognition of someone who had seen the same problem from every angle. We do what we've always done. We take the shot we can make and deal with consequences later. The extraction point is 40 miles south, Rachel said. Command will have people there. Once we arrive, we're in custody. Then we don't arrive. We find another way. There is no other way. We're in hostile territory. No support. Limited supplies. Rachel checked her ammunition count. I've got 22 rounds left. You? 18. 40 rounds between us. Against an entire region that wants us dead or captured. Sarah shrugged. We've faced worse odds. When? This morning. When we decided 2 rifles could save a battalion. Rachel couldn't help it. She laughed a short, sharp bark of recognition. Sarah was right. They had already committed to the impossible. Everything after that was just details. Okay, Rachel said. So we evade. We survive. Then what? Then we get home. Back to the States. We tell our story not to command, but to everyone. Public. Media. Make it impossible for them to bury us quietly. Sarah's eyes were bright, with the kind of tactical thinking that made her dangerous. They can court-martial us, but they can't silence us. Not if the whole country knows what happened in that valley. It was a plan. Not a good plan. It had about 100 ways to fail and maybe 2 ways to succeed. But it was better than surrender and better than running forever. We'll need to move at night, Rachel said, already thinking logistics. Avoid population centers. Live off the land as much as possible. I know a route. Used to study the maps during briefings. Sarah pulled out a folded map from her jacket. It was marked with pencil lines, notations, alternative paths. Figured we might need a way out someday. You've been planning this? I've been planning for us to have options. There's a difference. Rachel studied the map. The route Sarah had marked took them through some of the roughest terrain in the region: mountain passes, river valleys, areas where even the enemy didn't maintain regular patrols. It would take weeks. It would be brutal. People would be hunting them from multiple directions. It might work. When do we move? Rachel asked. Dark. 4 hours. Sarah repacked the map. Get some rest. When we start moving, we don't stop until we're clear. Rachel nodded. She should have felt fear they were about to become fugitives from their own military while trapped in hostile territory. Instead, she felt something else: purpose, clarity. The same feeling she had felt on the ridgeline when she decided to turn off her radio. Some choices weren't about protocols or consequences. Some choices were about looking at yourself in the mirror for the next 50 years. She closed her eyes and tried to rest. In 4 hours, they would begin the longest mission of their lives. No support, no backup, no one coming to save them. Just 2 sisters, 40 bullets, and a long walk home. They moved through darkness, like water through cracks. Rachel led the first leg, navigating by terrain, memory, and starlight. No GPS, those signals could be tracked. No radio, same problem. Just old-fashioned land navigation, using the mountains as reference points and dead reckoning to measure distance. Sarah followed 20 yards behind, watching their back trail, ensuring they left minimal sign. They moved in 30-minute increments, then stopped to listen. Listening was the most important skill in evasion. Your ears told you what your eyes couldn't see: distant engines, radio chatter, the distinctive sound of organized movement through terrain. For the first 3 hours, they heard nothing but wind and their own breathing. Then, around midnight, they heard helicopters. The sound came from the north, multiple rotors, probably search birds with thermal imaging. They were sweeping the ridgeline where Rachel and Sarah had been positioned, looking for bodies, looking for evidence, looking for the snipers who had saved a battalion and vanished. Rachel and Sarah pressed themselves into a ravine, covering themselves with loose rock and vegetation. The thermal blankets in their packs would mask their heat signatures, but only if they remained perfectly still. Even the slight warmth of breath could show up as anomaly on sensitive equipment. The helicopters passed overhead, searchlights painting the rocks in harsh white illumination. Rachel counted seconds between sweeps, calculating search patterns. They were being thorough. Someone important wanted answers. After 20 minutes, the helicopters moved on, continuing their grid search to the west. Rachel and Sarah waited another 30 minutes to be sure, then emerged from cover and kept moving. By dawn, they had covered 12 miles, not fast, but sustainable, and more importantly, they had moved perpendicular to the direction command would expect. The extraction point was south. They were heading southwest, toward the border regions where authority became negotiable and terrain made pursuit difficult. They found shelter in an abandoned shepherd's hut, barely more than stacked stones and a partial roof, but enough to hide them during daylight hours. Sarah took first watch while Rachel tried to sleep. She couldn't. Her mind kept returning to the valley, to the young Marine who had been digging futilely in frozen ground. Was he alive? Had the reinforcements arrived in time? Would he ever know who had been on that ridgeline? Probably not. The military would classify the incident. The official record would show that the battalion was reinforced by conventional forces, that casualties were acceptable, that protocol was followed. The sisters who had defied orders to save them would become a footnote, if they were mentioned at all. Unless they made it home. Unless they told the story themselves. Rachel drifted into uneasy sleep, her hand still wrapped around her rifle. Sarah woke her 4 hours later. Movement. East. Maybe 3 miles. Rachel was instantly alert. What kind? Foot patrol. Sounds organized. Could be ours, could be theirs. Either way, we don't want contact. They packed quickly and moved deeper into the mountains. The terrain was working against them now. The higher they climbed, the more exposed they became. But exposure was better than capture. They traveled for 6 more hours, stopping frequently to check their back trail. The patrol Sarah had heard never appeared. Maybe it had turned back, maybe it was still searching. Maybe it was coordinating with other units, setting up a net. By nightfall, they had gained another 15 miles, 27 total, a marathon distance under normal conditions. In mountains, with full gear, while evading pursuit, it was exceptional. It was also unsustainable. They couldn't maintain this pace for weeks. "We need to find supplies," Sarah said during their night halt. "Water especially. We're down to half a canteen each." Rachel knew. They had passed several streams, but water in this region was questionable without purification. They had tablets, but limited supply. Food was also becoming an issue. Their rations would last maybe 4 more days if they rationed carefully. "There's a village," Rachel said, checking her map, 20 miles south, southwest, remote, probably not worth military attention. "Could buy supplies." "With what currency?" "We've got American dollars and military scrip. Both will mark us as foreign." Sarah pulled out a small pouch from her pack. Inside were gold coins, local currency from their initial insertion, meant for emergency use with informants. Maybe $50 worth in total. "Emergency enough?" Sarah asked. Rachel nodded. "We go in separately. You buy food, I buy water and supplies. Meet at the northern checkpoint, 1 hour maximum." "And if one of us doesn't make it out?" "The other keeps moving." Rachel said it matter-of-factly, but the words tasted like ash. The thought of continuing without Sarah was unbearable, but sentiment was a luxury they couldn't afford. They reached the village around midnight. It was small, maybe 30 buildings, mostly dark. A few lights showed in windows. Somewhere, a dog barked at shadows. Sarah went first. She had a gift for blending in, for moving through spaces without drawing attention. Rachel watched from a distance as her sister entered a small shop that was still open, probably serving locals who worked night shifts or travelers passing through. Rachel approached from the other side, finding a different shop. The proprietor was an old man, half asleep behind his counter. She used hand gestures and her limited language skills to purchase water bottles, dried fruit, bread. The man barely looked at her, taking the coins and making change with the automatic motions of someone who had done this transaction 1,000 times. She was back on the street in 10 minutes. Sarah emerged from her shop 5 minutes later. They met at the northern edge of the village, exchanged nods, and kept walking. It wasn't until they were a mile clear that Sarah spoke. Someone was asking about Americans. Rachel's hand tightened on her rifle. "In the shop?" "Outside. I heard it through the window. Man asking if anyone had seen foreign soldiers. Offering money. Bounty hunters. Or intelligence gathering. Either way, someone knows we're in the region." They picked up their pace. The village had been a risk, but a necessary one. Now it was a marker on the map that would tell their pursuers which direction to search. For 3 more days, they moved through the mountains, climbing, descending, following ridgelines and stream beds, avoiding roads and settlements, living off the supplies they had bought and whatever they could forage. On the 4th day, they heard helicopters again. Closer this time. The search pattern had shifted. Whoever was hunting them had adjusted their search radius. "They found something," Rachel said. "A track, sign we left, something." "Or they're guessing better than we're evading," Sarah countered. That night, they made a decision. Instead of continuing southwest toward the border, they would turn directly south, then loop east. A longer route, but one that would take them through terrain too rough for helicopters to search effectively. It added a week to their journey, maybe 2. They would run out of supplies. They would have to risk another village, or find another source. But they would be alive. The 5th day, the weather turned. Snow began falling light at first, then heavy. Visibility dropped to yards, temperature plummeted. It was the kind of storm that killed unprepared travelers. Rachel and Sarah had trained in worse. They used the storm as cover, pushing through conditions that would ground helicopters and halt foot patrols. They covered 20 miles in 18 hours, leaving tracks that would be erased by snowfall within minutes. When the storm finally broke, they were 40 miles from where the search had focused. They had gained breathing room, but Rachel knew it wouldn't last. Someone wanted them badly enough to commit resources. Command didn't chase ghosts unless those ghosts represented a problem, and 2 snipers who had ignored Protocol 7 were definitely a problem. The question was, How much of a problem? And how far would command go to solve it? They found the abandoned military outpost on day 9. It sat on a ridge overlooking a narrow valley, one of dozens of positions that had been built during earlier conflicts and then left to decay when the wars moved elsewhere. The walls were crumbling, the roof mostly collapsed, but the foundation was sound, and the location gave them a commanding view of the terrain below. More importantly, it had a cache. Every outpost maintained supply caches, hidden stores of ammunition, medical supplies, rations. The military rarely recovered them during withdrawals. Too much effort, too little value. But for 2 fugitives running on empty supplies, a cache was salvation. Sarah found it under a loose stone in what had been the communications room. A metal container, sealed and buried, untouched for years. Inside, 6 boxes of ammunition matching their rifles, field dressings, water purification tablets, and a dozen MREs that were probably expired but still edible. "Someone's looking out for us," Sarah said, checking dates on the ammunition. "Or we're just lucky," Rachel replied. But she felt it too, a sense that the universe was conspiring to keep them moving forward. They spent the night in the outpost, taking turns on watch. Rachel took the second shift, keeping vigil in the pre-dawn hours when attacks were most likely. She watched the valley below, scanning for movement, for lights, for any indication they had been followed. Nothing. Just wind and darkness and the distant cry of a night bird. When Sarah relieved her at dawn, Rachel finally allowed herself to think beyond immediate survival. They had made it nearly 100 miles. They were approaching the border region, not an official border with checkpoints and customs, but the fuzzy zone where one country's authority faded and another's hadn't quite taken hold. If they could reach that zone, they could find people who didn't care about military protocols. Smugglers, traders, fixers who moved people and goods across borders for the right price. With the remaining gold coins, and possibly their weapons as barter, they might be able to arrange transport to somewhere safer. From there, it was a matter of finding an embassy, making contact with sympathetic journalists, telling their story before command could bury it. It was a long shot. But all their shots had been long. Thinking loud, Sarah said, settling in beside her. "About home. About what happens if we make it." "When we make it?" Rachel smiled. "When? Right. You having doubts?" "I'm having realism. We broke every rule. We're going to pay for that, even if we tell our story." "Maybe. But we'll pay on our terms, not theirs." Sarah checked the valley below. "You know what Dad used to say about consequences?" "Which quote?" "He had about 100. The one about owning your choices. He said the worst thing a Marine could do wasn't make a mistake, it was make a mistake and then pretend someone else was responsible." Sarah glanced at her sister. "We're owning this, all of it. That counts for something." Rachel nodded. It did count. Maybe not in a court-martial, but in the internal ledger they would both carry forever. They moved out at mid-morning, leaving the outpost as empty as they'd found it. The cache had extended their timeline. They could push for another week, maybe 2, before supplies became critical again. The terrain was changing. The high mountains were giving way to foothills, which would eventually flatten into the border plains. Easier travel, but less cover. They would need to be more careful. On day 11, they encountered people. A small group, 6 or 7 individuals, traveling on foot with pack animals. Not military, probably traders or nomads, moving goods between regions that didn't show up on official maps. Rachel and Sarah watched from a distance, trying to decide. These people might have information, they might have supplies to trade, they might also have radios, might be willing to report foreign soldiers for a reward. "Your call," Sarah said quietly. Rachel studied the group through her scope. Their body language was relaxed. They weren't moving tactically. They stopped to rest, to water their animals, to share food. Just people trying to make a living in a hard land. "We approach openly," Rachel decided. "Weapons visible but not threatening. See if they'll trade." They moved down from their observation position, making noise deliberately so they wouldn't appear to be ambushing. The traders spotted them immediately, went tense, reached for whatever weapons they carried, then saw it was just 2 women, alone, moving, without aggression. The leader stepped forward. He was old, maybe 60, with the kind of weathered face that came from decades under harsh sun. He spoke in the local language, which Rachel barely understood. She replied in slow, careful phrases. "We seek trade, food for gold." The old man studied them. His eyes lingered on their rifles, on their gear, on the way they carried themselves. He knew what they were. The question was whether he cared. He named a price, outrageous, 3 times what the supplies were worth. Rachel countered. The old man laughed and came down slightly. They settled on a price that was still too high but survivable. Rachel handed over coins. The old man produced dried meat, flatbread, cheese wrapped in cloth, real food, not military rations. As they were concluding the trade, the old man spoke again. Rachel caught only part of it, but the meaning was clear. Helicopters search for someone. Many helicopters. Many soldiers. You are careful. Yes? Rachel nodded. Yes, careful. The old man smiled, showing gaps in his teeth. Then he said something else, and this time his meaning was unmistakable. The Valley Battle. We hear stories. 2 women save many soldiers. He touched his chest in a gesture of respect. Allah watches over the brave. He knew. Rachel felt Sarah tense beside her. 1 word to authorities, 1 radio call, and this would end. They were at this man's mercy. The old man turned and spoke sharply to his group. They resumed packing, preparing to move on. Then he looked back at Rachel and Sarah. We see nothing. We go west. You go. He gestured vaguely. Wherever you must go, travel safe. He walked away without waiting for response. His group followed, and within minutes they were distant specks moving across the landscape. He knew, Sarah said quietly, and said nothing. Rachel watched the traders disappear. Because maybe some stories matter more than rewards. Maybe he lost people in these wars and respects anyone who tried to save others. Or maybe the old man simply didn't care about conflicts between foreign powers. Either way, he had given them something more valuable than food. He had given them the knowledge that not everyone would hunt them. They continued south. 3 days later, they reached the border zone. There were no signs, no fences, no official markers. But Rachel could sense the change in the land, in the settlements, in the way people moved. This was the margin, the edge, the place where rules loosened and survival trumped ideology. They found a small town that existed primarily to service the gray market. Goods moved through here that couldn't move through official channels. People passed through who couldn't pass through official borders. Rachel and Sarah needed exactly that kind of passage. They found a fixer in a tea house, a woman in her 40s, missing 2 fingers on her left hand, who conducted business in a back room filled with smoke and quiet conversations. Rachel explained what they needed in simple terms. Transport across the border. No questions. Cash payment. The woman quoted a price that would take every coin they had, plus their ammunition. No ammunition, Rachel said. We keep our weapons. The woman shrugged. Then no transport. Ammunition is valuable. Your rifles without bullets are just expensive clubs. Sarah caught Rachel's eye. They had a brief conversation in glances and minimal gestures. They had come too far to fail here. The ammunition was insurance, but it was insurance they might never need if they could just cross this last barrier. Agreed, Rachel said. But we keep the rifles. The woman nodded. 3 days. There is a truck convoy leaving for the south. You ride in container with cargo. Uncomfortable. Maybe dangerous. But you cross border and no one asks questions. How dangerous? Checkpoints sometimes search containers. If that happens, you are not our problem. You hide well or you face consequences. Rachel and Sarah exchanged another look. They had faced worse odds. We'll be ready, Rachel said. The woman collected their ammunition and half their remaining coins. The rest would be paid upon delivery. As they left the tea house, Rachel felt lighter. Not physically, they had just traded away 2/3 of their combat capability, but mentally, this was the final obstacle. 3 days and they would be across the border, beyond the immediate reach of military pursuit, free to find their way home. 3 days. They found an abandoned building to shelter in, a burned-out shell that had once been a warehouse. They took turns sleeping, conserving energy, preparing mentally for the final push. On the second night, Sarah spoke into the darkness. What do you think happens after? After we tell our story? Honestly, I don't know. Court-martial probably. Maybe prison time. Maybe just discharge. Worth it? Rachel thought about the young Marine in the valley, about the 1,000 lives that had seen another sunrise, about the principle that some orders were meant to be questioned. "Yeah," she said, "worth it." They waited for the third day, for the truck, for the journey that would take them home. The truck arrived before dawn, exactly as promised. It was a commercial transport, old, diesel-powered, carrying legal cargo in the front containers and less legal materials in the hidden compartments. The driver barely acknowledged Rachel and Sarah, simply pointing to a panel in the truck side that opened to reveal a space maybe 6 feet by 4 feet by 3 feet tall. "You fit," the driver said in broken English. "You stay quiet, no move when truck stops. We tell you when is safe." Rachel and Sarah climbed in. The space was smaller than advertised, cramped and airless. They had to lie on their sides, pressed against cargo crates that smelled of engine oil and something organic that had probably rotted months ago. The panel closed, plunging them into absolute darkness. The truck started moving. Rachel tried to track time and direction by feel, counting turns, estimating speed. But after an hour, her sense of orientation was completely scrambled. She had no idea if they were going south, west, or in circles. Beside her, Sarah's breathing was steady. Her sister had always been better at confined spaces, some gift of temperament or wiring that let her shut down claustrophobia through pure willpower. Rachel focused on breathing, in through the nose, out through the mouth, staying calm. This was temporary, uncomfortable but temporary. The truck stopped. Voices outside. Multiple voices, speaking in official tones. Rachel's linguistic skills weren't good enough to catch every word, but she recognized the cadence. Security forces, checkpoint guards, people with authority and suspicion. The truck's engine shut off. Someone climbed onto the truck bed. Footsteps moving along the containers. The sound of panels being opened. Cargo being inspected. The search was thorough. Rachel's hand found Sarah's in the darkness. Squeezed once, Sarah squeezed back. Whatever happened now happened together. The footsteps came closer, stopped right above their hidden compartment. Rachel held her breath, certain the panel would be ripped open, certain this was the end of their journey. The footsteps moved on. More sounds, more inspection. Voices raised in question, answered by the driver in tones of bored routine. This happened every crossing. The guards searched because that was their job. The driver tolerated it because that was his. After 30 minutes, the engine restarted. The truck resumed motion. They had passed through the checkpoint. Rachel exhaled slowly, relief flooding through her. Sarah's hand was still holding hers. Neither let go for the next hour. When the panel finally opened, daylight stabbed into the compartment like knives. Rachel squinted against the brightness, muscles cramped from hours of immobility. The driver's face appeared in the opening. Across border. 1 hour to city. Then you are not my problem. He closed the panel again, but looser this time. Air and light filtered through gaps. Rachel could see Sarah now, could see the exhaustion and determination in her sister's face. "Almost there," Sarah whispered. "Almost," Rachel agreed. The truck continued for another hour, then stopped in what sounded like a busy street. The panel opened fully. They climbed out, stiff and aching, into afternoon sunlight and city noise. The driver pointed down the street. "Embassy District. 4 blocks. You walk from here." He didn't wait for thanks. The panel closed, the truck pulled away, and Rachel and Sarah were left standing on a street corner in a foreign city, carrying rifles and wearing clothing that marked them as military even without insignia. They had to move fast. Drawing attention here was dangerous. They found an alley, stripped off their outer tactical gear, buried it in a dumpster. Underneath, they wore civilian clothes, wrinkled and dirty from days of travel, but unremarkable. The rifles went into hiking bags, broken down into components that wouldn't be immediately recognizable. Then they walked toward the Embassy District. 4 blocks became 8 because they took an indirect route, checking for surveillance, ensuring they weren't being followed. By the time they reached the embassy gates, it was nearly dusk. The Marines on guard duty looked them over with professional suspicion. 2 exhausted women, carrying heavy bags, approaching right before closing time. "We're American citizens," Rachel said. "We need to speak with someone. It's urgent." "Nature of your business?" Rachel glanced at Sarah. This was it. Once they said the words, there was no taking them back. "We're United States Marines," Rachel said. And we need to report a incident. The guard's posture shifted. Do you have identification? Rachel pulled out her military ID. It was battered from 2 weeks of hard travel, but readable. Sarah did the same. The senior guard spoke into his radio. Within minutes, an embassy official appeared, a woman in her 50s, dressed professionally, radiating competence and no-nonsense authority. I'm Margaret Chen, Deputy Chief of Mission. The guards say you're Marines? Yes, ma'am. Captain Rachel Hartwell and Lieutenant Sarah Hartwell. We need to speak with the defense attaché. Immediately. Chen studied them. You're not on any embassy roster. Where's your unit? That's what we need to discuss with the attaché, privately. Chen made a decision. Come with me. They were escorted into the embassy compound, through security screening, into a conference room where they waited under the watchful eyes of more guards. Neither Rachel nor Sarah was armed. The guards had confiscated their rifles, politely but firmly. After 20 minutes, a man in a Navy uniform entered. Commander rank insignia, defense attaché, or someone close to it. I'm Commander David Price. I understand you have information about an incident? Rachel took a breath. Here was the moment. The point where they stopped being fugitives and became something else. Whistleblowers, maybe, or heroes, or criminals, depending on who was listening. 2 weeks ago, 3rd Battalion, Marine Regiment was ambushed in a valley approximately 200 miles north of here. Command issued Protocol 7, ordered all support elements to withdraw. Lieutenant Hartwell and I were positioned as sniper overwatch. We disobeyed that order. We remained in position and provided fire support until reinforcements arrived. The battalion survived. We believe we would face court-martial for our actions. Price's expression didn't change. Protocol 7 is classified. How do you know about it? Because we received the order, and because we broke it. Can you prove your claims? Rachel pulled out a small notebook from her jacket. Every entry she had made during their mission. Coordinates, wind readings, shots taken, times, distances, a complete tactical log of everything that had happened on that ridgeline. Ballistics will match our rifles. Shell casings are still at the positions. The Marines in that valley can confirm someone provided sniper support. And command knows 2 snipers went dark exactly when Protocol 7 was issued. Price took the notebook, scanned a few pages. His expression finally changed, not to anger or approval, but to careful calculation. You understand what you're alleging? That you disobeyed a direct order during combat operations? Yes, sir. And you understand the potential consequences? Yes, sir. Then why turn yourselves in? You made it across the border. You could have disappeared. Rachel glanced at Sarah. This was the question they had debated during the long nights of travel. Why not just vanish? Why face judgment? Because the truth matters, Rachel said. Because 1,000 Marines lived, and someone needs to explain why command was willing to let them die. Because if we disappear, the story gets buried. But if we stand up and tell it, maybe something changes. Price was quiet for a long moment. Then he closed the notebook and looked at both sisters. You're both under military authority as of this moment. You'll be held here pending investigation. I'll need to contact CENTCOM, get guidance on how to proceed. This is complicated. We understand, sir. I'm not sure you do. Price stood. You saved lives. Command will acknowledge that. But you also broke the chain of command during active operations. The military can't function if everyone gets to choose which orders to follow. You've put command in an impossible position. With respect, sir, command put itself in that position when it issued Protocol 7, Sarah said. It was the first time she had spoken since entering the embassy. Price gave her a hard look. Then, surprisingly, he almost smiled. That's between you and the court-martial board, Lieutenant. For now, you're both confined to embassy quarters. Marines, escort them to the holding rooms. Rachel and Sarah were led away, separated for the first time in 2 weeks. As the door closed behind her, Rachel felt the weight of everything they had done settle onto her shoulders. They had made it. They were safe. They would tell their story. And then they would face whatever consequences came next. They held Rachel in isolation for 3 days. A small room in the embassy basement. Bed, desk, chair, no windows. Meals delivered by guards who wouldn't make eye contact. She wasn't technically under arrest, no charges had been filed, but she was definitely in custody. The first interrogation came on day 2. 2 officers from the Inspector General's office, a colonel and a major, both wearing the careful expressions of people conducting an investigation that could become politically explosive. They went through Rachel's notebook page by page, cross-referenced her statements against satellite data, battle reports, radio transcripts. They asked the same questions multiple ways, looking for contradictions or exaggerations. Rachel answered everything truthfully. No point in lying. The evidence would either support her or it wouldn't. You claim you shot 47 targets, the major said. That's an extraordinary number for a single engagement. I didn't shoot 47 people. I shot 47 times. How many were effective I can't confirm. Probably 30, maybe 35. The rest were suppressive fire or shots at equipment. Still a remarkable performance. My sister probably matched me. We had good positions and the enemy gave us targets. The colonel leaned forward. Why didn't you withdraw when ordered? Because withdrawing meant the battalion would be overrun. Protocol 7 is meant to preserve assets. We calculated that our presence could preserve more assets than our withdrawal. That's not your calculation to make, Captain. No, sir. But it was the calculation we made anyway. The interviews continued for hours. They took breaks, came back with new questions, probed for inconsistencies. Rachel answered until her voice was hoarse, then kept answering. On the 3rd day, they brought in Sarah. The sisters were kept separated, seated across a table in the same conference room where they had first made their report. Sarah looked tired but unbroken. They weren't allowed to speak to each other directly. The officers asked questions, directed answers. Lieutenant Hartwell, did your sister order you to remain in position? No, sir. We discussed options and came to the same conclusion independently. So, it was a joint decision? Yes, sir. Who turned off their radio first? Sarah glanced at Rachel. Does that matter? It establishes chain of command and responsibility. We both turned off our radios within seconds of each other. I don't know who was first. I don't care. The colonel made a note. You understand that disobeying Protocol 7 is a serious offense? I understand that following Protocol 7 would have been a more serious offense, sir. The interrogation went on. They were looking for something, evidence of conspiracy, maybe, or proof of premeditation. Some legal angle that would make this easier to prosecute or excuse. Rachel knew they wouldn't find it. She and Sarah had made their decision in the moment, based on the situation in front of them. It wasn't planned, it wasn't malicious. It was just 2 Marines making the call they thought they had to make. Finally, after 8 hours of questioning, the colonel closed his file. You'll both remain in custody pending command review. A court-martial board is being convened. You'll have access to legal counsel. In the meantime, you're restricted to embassy grounds. Rachel and Sarah were escorted back to their separate rooms. As they passed in the hallway, Rachel caught her sister's eye. Sarah gave the smallest nod. They had done everything they could. Now it was out of their hands. Days passed. Rachel read, exercised in her small room, thought about everything that had led to this point. She tried not to think about worst-case scenarios, years in military prison, dishonorable discharge, the end of everything they had worked for. But she couldn't stop thinking about the young Marine in the valley, whether he had gone home, whether he knew about the sisters on the ridge. On the 7th day, Commander Price returned. You have a visitor, he said. Not official, not part of the investigation, but someone asked to see you, and I'm allowing it. He led Rachel to a different conference room. Sitting at the table was a man in his 50s, wearing a Marine uniform with Colonel insignia. His face was weathered, his eyes were sharp, and something about him was familiar. Captain Hartwell, the Colonel said. I'm Colonel Thomas Morrison. I commanded 3rd Battalion in the Valley. Rachel's throat tightened. This was the officer whose Marines she had saved, the one who would have watched his entire command die without intervention. Sit down, Captain. Rachel sat. Colonel Morrison studied her for a long moment. I've been briefed on what you and your sister did. The IG showed me your tactical logs, your fire patterns, your casualty estimates. He paused. You saved my Marines. All of them. And I'm here to tell you, thank you. Rachel didn't know what to say. Thank you seemed inadequate. Explaining seemed unnecessary. I'm also here to tell you, Morrison continued, that what you did has created a shitstorm at levels above both our pay grades. CENTCOM is furious. The Joint Chiefs are arguing about it. Politicians are asking questions. I understand, sir. I'm not sure you do. Protocol 7 exists for a reason. It's meant to prevent small unit leaders from making tactical decisions that have strategic consequences. You and your sister overrode that protocol. You decided you knew better than command. Yes, sir. We did. And you were right. Morrison leaned back. My Marines, 1,000 of them went home because 2 snipers decided to ignore orders. That's not supposed to happen. It's not how the system works, but it's what happened. Sir, are you testifying at the court-martial? That's why I'm here. I've been asked to provide testimony about the tactical situation, about what would have happened without your intervention, about the effectiveness of Protocol 7 in this context. Rachel waited. This could go either way. Morrison could testify that they saved lives, or he could testify that they undermined command authority. Both were true. Which truth mattered depended on what the Corps valued more. I'm going to tell them, Morrison said slowly, that Protocol 7 was the wrong call, that the situation on the ground didn't match the assumptions behind the protocol, that my Marines would have been slaughtered if command's order had been followed. He looked directly at Rachel. I'm going to tell them that you and your sister demonstrated the kind of tactical judgment that the Corps is supposed to train into its leaders. And that if exercising that judgment means court-martial, then the system is broken. Rachel felt something unclench in her chest. Not relief, she was still facing charges, still looking at possible prison time, but validation. Someone who had been there, who had commanded the Marines they saved, was willing to stand up and say they had done the right thing. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet. This isn't over. There are people in command who want to make an example of you, who believe that discipline matters more than outcomes, who think that letting you walk sets a dangerous precedent. Morrison stood. But there are also people, myself included, who think the real precedent is punishing Marines for saving lives. We'll see which side wins. He left. Rachel sat alone in the conference room, processing what she had heard. The court-martial was coming. The judgment would be rendered, but at least now she knew that someone would speak for them. Someone who mattered, whose voice carried weight, who had been in the valley when the bullets were flying. It wasn't much, but it was something. The court-martial convened 6 weeks later at Marine Corps Base Quantico. Rachel and Sarah were flown back to the United States under guard. They were processed, assigned legal counsel, given the formal charges, disobeying a direct order in time of combat, operating outside established chain of command, unauthorized engagement with enemy forces. The maximum sentence for each charge was years in confinement. Combined, they could face decades in military prison. Their lawyer was a captain named Jennifer Reeves, a JAG officer with 12 years' experience in military law. She was blunt in their first meeting. The facts aren't in dispute. You disobeyed orders. You broke protocol. Command has documentation of everything. The only question is, mitigation. Can we convince the court that your actions were justified under the circumstances? Can we? Rachel asked. Maybe. The challenge is that the military can't function if everyone gets to decide which orders to follow. The court has to balance your specific situation against the broader principle of discipline. Reeves spread out documents on the table between them. Our best argument is necessity defense, that following orders would have resulted in greater harm than disobeying them, but that requires proving command made the wrong call with Protocol 7. We have evidence, Sarah said. The tactical situation, the casualties that would have resulted, Colonel Morrison's testimony, all of which will be countered by the prosecution arguing that tactical decisions aren't made by captains and lieutenants in the field. They're made by command with access to larger strategic picture. Reeves looked at both sisters. Be prepared for this to get ugly. The Corps is divided on this. Some people see you as heroes, others see you as a threat to good order and discipline. The trial will become proxy for that larger debate. The court-martial lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution presented their case methodically. Radio transcripts showing the Protocol 7 order, testimony from the operations officer who had issued it, expert witnesses explaining why battlefield commanders can't be allowed to freelance. The most damaging testimony came from a brigadier general who had helped write the protocols. Protocol 7 exists precisely because junior officers in the field don't have the information necessary to make strategic decisions. Captain Hartwell and Lieutenant Hartwell believed they were saving lives, but they didn't know what resources were being marshaled for rescue. They didn't know the larger operational picture. They made a decision based on incomplete information and got lucky. Next time, that kind of freelancing could trigger an international incident or compromise a larger operation. Reeves cross-examined aggressively. General, were resources being marshaled for rescue? The situation was being evaluated. That's not what I asked. Were resources actively being deployed to save 3rd Battalion? The general hesitated. Not at the time Protocol 7 was issued. So the battalion was being abandoned? They were being evaluated as acceptable losses in a fluid tactical situation. Acceptable losses. 1,000 Marines. Acceptable. Reeves let that hang in the courtroom. General, if Captain Hartwell and Lieutenant Hartwell had followed orders, would those Marines have survived? That's impossible to determine. Colonel Morrison determined it. He commanded those Marines. He testified that without sniper support, his battalion would have been overrun by dawn. Do you dispute his assessment? I dispute that Captain Hartwell and Lieutenant Hartwell had the authority to make that calculation. The prosecution rested after 10 days. The court had heard extensive testimony about protocol, about chain of command, about the necessity of discipline in military operations. Now it was the defense's turn. Reeves called Colonel Morrison first. He testified for 6 hours, describing the tactical situation in detail. The enemy disposition, the inadequacy of his defensive position, the certainty of annihilation if dawn had come without support. The sniper fire changed everything, Morrison said. The enemy lost command cohesion. They lost initiative. They went from confident attackers to confused defenders. That bought us time until reinforcements arrived. The prosecutor cross-examined. Colonel, do you believe junior officers should be allowed to override command decisions? I believe officers should be trained to exercise judgment. That's what Captain Hartwell and Lieutenant Hartwell did. They looked at the situation, made a calculation, and acted accordingly. Even when that action violated direct orders? Morrison paused. I would rather be court-martialed for saving lives than decorated for following orders that led to massacre. The courtroom went silent. Reeves called other witnesses. The young Marine Rachel had watched through her scope. Now, Corporal Daniel Hayes, 20 years old, alive because 2 women had defied orders. He testified with tears in his eyes, describing the desperate hours of darkness, the certain knowledge that dawn would bring death, and then the impossible sound of sniper fire from the ridgeline. They saved us, Hayes said simply. I don't understand why that's a crime. The prosecution objected. The court sustained. Hayes' opinion on legality wasn't relevant, but the emotion was. The court-martial board, 5 officers, ranging from major to colonel, watched Hayes testify. They heard the crack in his voice. They saw the impact of Rachel and Sarah's decision measured in living, breathing, human terms. Finally, Reeves called Rachel and Sarah themselves. Rachel testified first. She described her thought process clearly, without apology or false humility. She had weighed options. She had chosen the course of action most likely to preserve life. She had known it violated protocol. She had done it anyway. Did you consider that your actions might encourage other Marines to disobey orders? The prosecutor asked during cross-examination. No, sir. I considered that following orders would result in 1,000 deaths. That seemed like the more significant consequence. You put your judgment above command's judgment. I put the lives of Marines above a protocol that didn't account for the actual situation we faced. The prosecutor pressed harder. Rachel didn't yield. She had spent 2 weeks running through mountains, 6 weeks preparing for this moment. She knew what she had done and why. She wouldn't pretend otherwise to make the court more comfortable. Sarah's testimony was shorter but equally firm. When asked if she regretted her actions, she answered without hesitation, "No, sir. I'd do it again." The trial concluded. Closing arguments were made. The board retired to deliberate. Rachel and Sarah waited for 3 days. They were kept in separate quarters but allowed brief contact during meals. Neither spoke much. What was there to say? They had told the truth. They had made their case. Now, 5 officers would decide their future. On the 4th day, they were called back to the courtroom. The board had reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed. Word had spread during the trial. Media had picked up the story twin sisters court-martialed for saving battalion. Public opinion was divided. Veterans groups were loudly supporting Rachel and Sarah. Military leadership was largely silent, letting the process play out. Rachel and Sarah stood at attention as the board filed in. 5 officers, their faces carefully neutral. The president of the board, a colonel with combat decorations from 3 wars, carried a folder containing the verdict. The court-martial board has reached findings on all charges, the colonel announced. The accused will remain standing. Rachel felt Sarah shift slightly beside her. Their shoulders were almost touching. They had faced everything else together. They would face this together too. On the charge of disobeying a direct order in time of combat, we find the accused. The colonel paused, letting the weight settle. Guilty. Rachel's stomach dropped. She had expected this, the facts were undeniable, but hearing it stated formally still hit hard. On the charge of operating outside established chain of command, we find the accused guilty. 2 for 2. One more charge remaining. On the charge of unauthorized engagement with enemy forces, we find the accused guilty. 3 guilty verdicts. The maximum sentence now loomed: years in confinement, dishonorable discharge, the end of their military careers, and possibly their freedom. But the colonel wasn't finished. This board has considered extensive testimony regarding the circumstances surrounding these violations. We have heard from commanders, from Marines whose lives were preserved, from experts on military protocol and tactical decision-making. We have reviewed the tactical situation in detail and assessed the likely outcomes had the accused followed orders. He looked directly at Rachel and Sarah. The board finds that while the accused clearly violated direct orders, they did so in a situation where following those orders would have resulted in catastrophic loss of American lives. We find that their tactical judgment, while outside proper chain of command, was sound and demonstrated the kind of initiative the Marine Corps claims to value in its leaders. Rachel hardly dared to breathe. This was sounding less like condemnation and more like, therefore, while upholding the guilty verdicts on all charges, this board recommends sentencing at the minimum end of available options. The accused are sentenced to reduction in rank of 1 grade, forfeiture of 1 month's pay, and formal reprimand to be placed in permanent record. No confinement, no discharge. The courtroom erupted. Spectators talking, reporters scrambling for phones, officers conferring in whispers. The colonel raised his hand for silence. This board further notes that Captain now First Lieutenant Hartwell and Lieutenant now Second Lieutenant Hartwell demonstrated extraordinary skill, courage, and tactical judgment under pressure. While we cannot endorse violation of protocol, we acknowledge that rigid adherence to protocol in this instance would have resulted in unacceptable casualties. This court-martial should serve as impetus for review of Protocol 7 and similar doctrines to ensure they account for the kind of tactical flexibility demonstrated by the accused. He closed the folder. This court-martial is concluded. The accused are released from custody and returned to duty status pending administrative processing of these findings. The gavel fell. Rachel and Sarah remained at attention for a moment, processing. They were guilty. They had been convicted. But they weren't going to prison. They weren't being discharged. They had been demoted and reprimanded, but they were still Marines. Captain Reeves was smiling. That's about as good as we could have hoped for. The board threaded a perfect needle, upheld discipline while acknowledging you saved lives. Colonel Morrison appeared from the gallery. Congratulations, you're officially criminals with commendations. Sir? Rachel wasn't sure she had heard right. The board included a commendation in your files. You'll have both a formal reprimand and a formal commendation. Future commanders will have to decide which matters more. He shook both their hands. I've already decided. If either of you want a position in my command, you've got it. Sarah laughed, the first genuine laugh Rachel had heard from her in months. Are you sure you want snipers who don't follow orders? I want snipers who know when orders are wrong and have the courage to act accordingly. That's different than not following orders. Morrison smiled. Think about it. No rush. He left. Other people approached Marines from 3rd Battalion who had attended the trial, officers who wanted to shake their hands, even a few reporters who got past security. Through it all, Rachel and Sarah stood together, still processing what had happened. They had been convicted. punished. Their careers would always carry the mark of this court-martial. Future promotions would be harder. Some doors would close, but they had survived. They had told their story. And most importantly, 1,000 Marines had gone home because two sisters decided that some principles mattered more than protocol. As the courtroom cleared, Rachel looked at Sarah. "You okay?" "Yeah." "You?" "Yeah." They didn't need to say more. They had made their choice on a frozen ridgeline at dawn. They had faced consequences. They had accepted judgment. And they would live with the results, whatever those turned out to be. Because some shots were worth taking, even when you knew you'd pay for pulling the trigger. "What now?" Sarah asked. Rachel thought about it. They had been through combat, through pursuit, through trial. They had been convicted and vindicated in the same breath. They had lost rank and gained respect. They had broken rules and upheld principles. "Now we go back to work," Rachel said. "We're still Marines. We're still snipers. Someone still needs people who can make the hard shots." Sarah nodded. Together? Always together. They walked out of the courtroom side by side, twin sisters who had saved a battalion at dawn and paid the price at sunset, ready for whatever came next. Because that's what Marines did. They adapted, they overcame, they moved forward. And sometimes, when the situation demanded it, they ignored protocol and did what was right instead of what was ordered. The story would follow them for the rest of their careers. The Hartwell sisters, the snipers who defied Protocol 7, the women who chose lives over orders. Some would use it to question their judgment. Others would use it to celebrate their courage. Rachel didn't care about either interpretation. She cared that Corporal Daniel Hayes had gone home to his family, that 1,000 Marines had lived to fight another day, that somewhere in the records there was an account of what happened when two women decided that protocol was negotiable but human life wasn't. That was enough. The rest was just noise. They stepped out into Virginia's sunlight, diminished in rank but unbroken in spirit, ready for the next mission. Because the war was never really over. It just took different forms. And somewhere, sometime, there would be another valley, another battalion, another impossible choice. And if Rachel and Sarah were there, they would